most with cones for seeds, most with needles for leaves. C is for conifers, more than 500 kinds.
It's spring, time for such tasty greens as asparagus, pokeweed, ramps, lamb's quarters, stinging nettle, and spruce. This evergreen, which is used primarily as a Christmas tree, is also a source of some unusual edibles. Spruces are frequently planted in parks and public places. They're usually the tallest trees in an area and often tower above their neighbors. Their bark is reddish-brown. Needles are individually attached to the twigs, but if they're stripped off, you can see the bumpy branches. In the spring, last year's distinctive female cones are often found scattered underneath the tree. But to be absolutely sure of proper identification, try my ouch test. Grab a branch, and the sharp needles will let you know you've found the right tree. In early May, small edible male cones appear at the ends of spruce branches. Cones from either native or non-native varieties are fine. I collect mine from Norway spruce. Their brilliant magenta pink color creates a stunning contrast against the dark green needles. Look closely to see the delicate scalloped design that circumvents each cone. These male cones can be found all over the tree. Although larger female cones grow on the same tree, they're usually so high up they're not noticeable until they begin to turn brown. I found these two young ones on the ground after a storm. The newest is on the left. Male cones are prolific pollen producers. If you're lucky enough to catch them at the right time, you can get some of your own. Before they release their pollen, I gather some to add to my early spring salads. When they start to swell, I harvest them for their pollen. Pick cones when they're somewhat hard, but not too soft, which can be tricky to determine. You're too late when the cones enlarge and get mushy. The pollen has already been released. When cones are ready to pollinate, bring them inside and place on parchment paper so they can shed their pollen. Let them sit for several days as pollen keeps on coming. Sift and place the fine yellow powder in a glass jar. It doesn't matter if some vegetative scraps remain in the pollen. Then put it in the freezer to use later. And when they're done, it's off to the compost pile. While collecting the cones, you may notice bright green tips emerging from the end of the darker needles. These tender tips are popular with gourmet chefs, eager to be the first to incorporate them into their menus. Before you go off merrily picking tips, I want to emphasize the importance of correct identification. Young tips of fir trees are edible and can be used like those of the spruce. Fir needles are flat and soft to the touch. But so are those of the toxic shrub yew, and you should avoid it. It's often used as a hedge and is much smaller than fir and spruce. Yew has no cones and is the only conifer with berries. These are red with a brown seed inside and appear in late summer. This arrangement of the three types of needles may help distinguish them from each other. Yew is on the left with developing berries on the branch. Fir is in the middle with whitish lines on the back of the needles. And spruce is on the right with needles that look like hairbrush bristles. Now let's explore how to use spruce tips. At first, these are protected with brown papery casings, which should be removed before using. These coverings keep the tender tips clean, so there's no need to rinse them. Each tree has its own distinct taste. Try a sample before you collect. It's a simple way to freshen your breath. Their flavor is mild and piney with a hint of citrus. If you look at the tree when the tips are emerging, it's easy to imagine these feathery growths as Mother Nature's version of dainty paintbrushes. Collect tips for a couple of weeks in early May. Since they don't all appear at once, you have some time to do so. Distinguish new tips from old by color and feel. New ones are lime green, soft, and flexible. Old ones are darker, stiff, spiky, and pointy. An exception is Colorado spruce. Its young tips are pale green, and its older needles are bluish-gray. Eventually, the fresh growth on all species fans out and transforms into hard needles, so gather them before this happens. Harvesting is effortless. Gently pull the tips, and off they'll come. Their size varies, but if they're soft enough to cut through with your fingernail, then they're okay to collect, even if they seem too long. Avoid completely stripping tips from one tree, as these are the new spring growth. Because spruces are so common, there'll be plenty of tips to gather from other trees. Store tips in the fridge for 2 weeks. Freeze any excess for later by first laying them on parchment paper and then placing them in a jar for long-term storage. There are so many uses for spruce tips that you can discover on various websites. Here are just a few of the simple and easiest ones that I make. I add dried tips and dried nettle leaves to salt to enhance its flavor. I also put the tips into apple cider vinegar. Let it sit for 4 to 6 weeks, as it's doing here, then strain the tips out. Tips are especially good for tea when they're young. I place a tablespoon of them in a teapot, pour boiling water over them, cover, and let sit for 5 to 10 minutes. Then I'll strain and serve it. This tea is high in vitamin C and has a subtle taste. One of my favorite things to do is to mix the tips into what I call my Cinco de Mayo mayo, because they're usually ready to pick by the 5th of May. To make it, arrange the tips on a cutting board and chop them up into small pieces. You don't want these to be too big. Then add and stir them into a high-quality mayonnaise. When enough is mixed up, transfer it to a jar and put it in the fridge. So maybe now it's time for you to spruce up your life.
C is for conifers, my kind of trees.